Great. So we have Bruce Porter, a leading international expert on remedies for social and economic rights, here with us today. And he is also on the steering committee of the National Right to Housing Network. So thanks for joining with us and chatting with us about this important topic today, Bruce.
Well, thanks for having me. Looking forward to it. It's a really important topic.
So my first question for you, Bruce, is that the National Housing Strategy Act says that review panels can issue opinions and recommendations. But a lot of folks in our sector often think this means policy recommendations because that's what we're used to doing. So, could you explain to us how human rights recommendations differ from a policy recommendation?
Yeah, that's a good question and a tough one. I mean, obviously, there are going to be policy, like recommendations for policy changes, or for, the legislation talks about recommendation for measures. And so there is going to be, policy program initiatives that are required for compliance with the right to housing. And that's the nature of social and economic rights, like the right to housing. They require often positive measures in order to comply with human rights. But at the same time, we refer to these as remedies, that social and economic rights, like the right to housing, have to be subject to effective remedies. And so that if a review panel is hearing of a systemic issue which results in people not enjoying the equal right to housing with others, or if they're living with homelessness or other violations, like evictions or so on, then that violation has to be subject to effective remedies. And so the language of the legislation is kind of hybrid. It doesn't refer to a legal finding and an ordered remedy. It talks about an opinion about what Canada needs to do to comply with the right to housing, and then measures that are needed to achieve compliance. So it's important to see it as, it's going to involve policy changes and programs and so on often. And some of those are going to take time to be put into effect. So that's the challenge in social and economic rights, like the right to housing. It's not as simple as saying, oh, you were discriminated against, you should get this job, here's the job. And that's immediate, and it's all over, and the court goes on its way. Or you sue somebody for money and you get compensation and the court goes on its way. This is different, where a lot of the things that have to be done are very substantive and may take time to implement. And so over the last 10 or 20 or 30 years, there's been a lot of work done on how do you craft remedies to things like the right to housing so that they're effective. Because if you, on the one hand, if you just say, well, you've got to do more to realize the right to housing over the next 10 years, and it doesn't have any specifics identified, then without precision, then you can't really ensure that the government does anything because it's going to be too unclear. On the other hand, if you only go for remedies or recommendations that are very specific, like, you have to change the affordability requirement in the national housing strategies to 70% of median income or something, then you're being more precise than maybe is helpful, because you're getting into micromanaging when these are things that actually need to be worked out in more detail than a review panel is able to do. And also, there's the whole issue of context, that what might be the right percentage in one community might not be the right percentage in others. So this is the balancing act that a review panel or courts all around the world are wrestling with. And so the challenge is to be as precise as possible, but to be flexible where necessary. That's one of the key elements. And then the other element that's so important in crafting effective remedies or recommendations to the right to housing is that you have to realize, sort of think about, what is the review panel, what's its job, what's the government's job, and what's civil society's role. And all of those have an important role. Sometimes people say, well, I mean, a review panel of 3 people, what do they know compared to all the experts at CMHC and so on? And so there is an element of humility that's involved, where you have to say, yeah, you're right, we don't have all of the expertise that housing policy experts may have or statisticians. But on the other hand, we have a role to play, and that is our role isn't to design every element of housing policy, it's to review particular issues and consider whether it's complying with the right to housing. And that's a different undertaking than a housing policy person who made a decision about, how many RGI units should be in certain buildings. Because you're looking at it, first of all, you're looking at it differently from the standpoint of the complainant, from the standpoint of the obligations to ensure the right to housing based on appropriate means and available resources. And so you design a remedy based on those international norms. You have to try to tell the government what it needs to do, not to come up with the policy that you think is better, but rather with the policy that is in compliance with the right to housing under international law. And so the remedy should be referencing the human rights obligations and then with as much precision as possible, saying what it is that the government needs to do. And where it involves time, it's important to actually put timelines in place or to have some sort of report back requirements. And different bodies and courts have taken different approaches to that. You could sometimes courts will what's called maintain jurisdiction, say report back to the court over the next few months or years to say what you've done, and I'm going to review it. Or you can say, well, you need to report to the Human Rights Commission or the Federal Housing Advocate or an independent body, and they will monitor compliance. Or you need to make reports to the Minister of Housing or whatever. But so if you create some sort of time frame and reporting and monitoring mechanism, you can ensure that a remedy that requires time to implement is appropriately implemented. And then, a final element is the role of stakeholders, rights holders, civil society, indigenous peoples, and so on. And what we've learned in the last couple of decades is that you can't have effective remedies or implemented recommendations to fundamental rights like the right to housing without meaningful engagement with the rights holders. So I know that we've talked about meaningful engagement in terms of designing the programs and meaningful engagement in the hearing process and so on, but you also have to have meaningful engagement in the implementation of remedies. And by that, I don't just mean that we hound the Minister of Housing saying, you've got to implement the remedy that the review panel told you to implement. Usually there's going to be, within the remedy that the review panel identifies, there's often going to be a component. You need to engage with people with disabilities that need support services to ensure that they have access to adequate housing in the community, or you need to negotiate with Indigenous partners in terms of co-creating this. There's always going to be that element, and it needs to be taken very seriously as a kind of legal requirement that here's what you were required to do. So those are all the complexities, but key to all of that, to go back to the original question about sort of recommendations versus human rights remedies, the key difference is that you have to think of it as a legal obligation that you can't shirk. And it has to be taken seriously. So international human rights bodies will often render decisions in human rights cases and say that these are recommendations, and it's really just, and they may not be enforceable, just as the review panel's recommendations aren't legally enforceable, but they have the same moral and legal weight of a decision that is enforceable because they are talking about what's required to ensure a fundamental human right. And so we have to make sure that we don't just treat them as kind of policy recommendations that the government can accept or reject as it wishes. The obligation under international law is in good faith to implement the decisions of international human rights bodies.